So we are now recording. I would like to welcome you all to the Reimagining the Seven Principles companion to the poster session being held at the 2020 Virtual GA. My name is Mathew P. Taylor, and I, as well as my co-host Erik, will be your facilitators today for this discussion. Can you all breathe with me for a second? Just take a deep breath in and then out. We have had a very busy GA, and now we have a moment to sit together and talk about our 7 principles. But before we get started, I would like us to take a moment to light our sacred chalices to symbolize our union together at this moment. We light this first chalice, our UU chalice, to signify the joining of communities, the joining of minds, the joining of ideals, so that we can create a great change within our faith tradition and the world. Erik, will you light the candle? Oh, thank you. You already got it.
It is lit.
The second candle we would like to light, we would like to acknowledge that for those of us that are here in the United States, as well as around the world, may be sitting on indigenous land, we acknowledge that this is not our land. This is the land of people who took way better care of this land. If you know the name of the people whose land you sit upon, please type it in the chat box below. There's also a link which I will be dropping in the chat in a moment if you do not know your land, so that way you can find that out. The last chalice that we would like to light today is for social justice. This is for the injustices that have been happening in our country this last 6 months and the remaining 400 years that brought us to this point. We call this a social justice candle because it not only represents the Black lives that have been lost, but all of our Black, Indigenous, and other people of color siblings who have been impacted by police brutality and other social justice. I ask for just one more moment for you to breathe with me. And breathe out. And let this conversation begin. We're going to be pulling up a slideshow so that you can follow along. So first, just brief information about myself. I have a bachelor's in communications. I am currently a Star King student and a 5th-year seminarian. I have over 15 years experience working in community doing organizing, as well as leading in pagan circles. I am brought to this space today because I have found a love and a desire and a need to uplift and figure out the way that our faith tradition is moving into the future. And Erik, I invite you if you would like to introduce yourself.
Okay. I am a, I don't know what I'm, 4th-year seminarian or 5th, depending on how you count. And hopefully I'm starting my last year at Star King. And that's my son there in the picture. And yeah, there we go. Let's kick this off. We don't have a lot of time.
Yes. So our basic agreements. So what this space is, it's a space for transformation, a place for beginning healing, and a place to learn about the history of our 7 principles. This is also a place to respectfully discuss our topics at hand, and it's a place for curious exploration.
And what the space is not. So this is not a space for white tears, nor is it a place for absolving white guilt. It is not a place to explain away history. It is also not a place to put blame on others. And it is also not a place in which people of color are expected to do the heavy lifting. So why this topic and why now? And just as a note, we originally designed this as about a 75-minute discussion, and we have 40. So let's just be aware of that. And we're going to kind of go quickly through some of this. So this was written more than 30 days ago. 30 days ago, a little over 30 days ago is when George Floyd was murdered. That being said, obviously, the problems that existed before are the same problems we have now. We are in a place of societal turmoil, class warfare, and political upheaval. And as you know, we're all aware, there is a lot of bias and systemic white supremacy all over the place in every institution across the land. You know, we face issues such as immigration. There's the immigration and asylum crisis. We saw the Supreme Court was it yesterday, hand down their decision that's going to affect H-1B visa holders, which is upwards of potentially 550,000 people. Police brutality, even in the time of coronavirus. I admit to, at the beginning of coronavirus, as the lockdown started happening, feeling like maybe the police will give it a break because there's just going to be less people out and about. And no, it has gotten, it's just the same. We still see attacks on the rights of LGBTQIA plus people. And what we're seeing overall with this is that there's kind of this bellwether that was, before the last 30 days of protest, pointing towards a fundamental change in our democracy. I think now, over the last 30 days, what we're seeing is, again, a fundamental change in our democracy, but perhaps a swing back towards justice beginning to happen in many spaces. And as you use in an ever-changing world, we want to talk about the principles and make sure that they reflect the current state of the world and where our moral place is in it, because they are not a stagnant, archaic, well, they may be archaic, but they are not supposed to sit still forever. They are a living document.
So we offer you some questions to think about while being in this presentation. First is, how can we think about the 7 principles given their nature as a living document? How do we interpret them now? And what could they look like in the future? And lastly, can Unitarian Universalism be the faith to bring liberation to all people? And so keep in mind, we will be coming back to these questions as we move through. With our 7 principles, we will just go through and just read them very quickly, and then we will discuss them in more detail once we get to our discussion portion. So first principles, the inherent worth and dignity of every person. The second is justice, equity, and compassion in human relations. The third is acceptance of one another and encouragement of spiritual growth in our congregations. The fourth is a free and responsible search for truth and meaning.
The fifth is the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process within our congregations and in society at large. The sixth principle is the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all. And the seventh principle, respect for the interdependent web of all existence, of which we are a part.
So this slide is here because we want to just take a brief moment to give basics. Again, because we are under a time crunch, we do not want to extend too much time here, but this is something that we can have as a part of further discussion after. Just as information for you all, we do have a Facebook group that has been set up called Reimagining the 7 Principles, so that way we can continue this conversation after, as well as we've been tapped on the shoulder by Paula Cole-Jones, and I forget the other gentleman who's on the current commission that's working on changing Article 2, which are our principles and purposes. So to just start off, our 7 principles, or actually 6 principles, were a part of the merger between the Unitarians and the Universalists that happened between 1961 and 63.
But the old ones were very much different than the 6 principles we know today, which actually the period of 1960 to 1985 didn't include what we now know as the first 6 principles.
Thank you, Erik. And then I'm going to go forward. So as a part of that, while doing the research about the 7 principles, this quote came up. I will read it for you. It says, "The deeper malaise lies in our confusion as to what word we have to spread. The old watchwords of liberalism, freedom, reason, tolerance, worthy though they may be, are simply not catching the imagination of the contemporary world. They describe a process for approaching the religious depths, but they testify to no intimate acquaintance with the depths themselves. If we are ever to speak to a new age, we must supplement our seeking with some profound religious finds." So this quote was in response to our principles. And as you can see, this was from 1979 by the Reverend Eugene Pickett. From this whole quote, we hope that you take a look at and hold in your heart the bolded text. Erik, do you want to take this first part about 1986?
So in 1986, the 6 principles, the first 6 principles that we now know were adopted. And that was 34 years ago. 10 years later, in 1995, the 7th principle, the interdependent web, right, was adopted as a nod to the earth-based traditions within our faith. And since then, they have sat static. And I think a key thing to take away from their static nature, there's 2 things that always strike me. First, they were never supposed to be a static document. There is specifically language about a 15-year cycle of review. I'm not sure why they chose 15 years, but it sounds like a good number, good as anything. And as we can see, since 1986, 34 years ago, the first 6 principles haven't changed. We've added 1 more. And other than that, they are what they are. And in discussing this with people, whether or not we originally worked on this up at a justice workshop at a Southern California UU camp, there was a lot of and I hear this in congregations, a lot of pushback against the ideas that they're not. How am I going to learn more different principles? Why do they need to change? Aren't they good enough? Don't they cover, everything? And most people don't know that they were never designed to be a static document. And the second thing is for a non-creedal faith, we really have kind of glommed onto these as a creed because we view them as a total faith tradition, as a static document that can't change, at which point it becomes a creed. So
can I add something real quick?
Oh, absolutely.
One of the things that I did want to add in talking about being at that camp, while we were at that camp, the idea of doing this workshop came up out of a need to find a way to, 1, fill space, but 2, try and connect with the campers in a deeper way. And one of the things I do want to uplift is there was a person that was there who said that for them, the 7 principles was just a bunch of words. And I think that that might be a common feeling amongst people that are either going to a UU church or may identify as UU, because I'm not sure that they are getting the adequate education about what our principles can actually mean. And also surveying those folks, many times they've made the reference to the 7 principles were the thing that they would point at in their churches to say what UUs believe. And so this conversation is meant to help us have a deeper conversation and to see if there's a change or a way that our principles can help lead us into the future. And Erik, I'll put it back to you.
No, I think, I guess the only other thing would be if we look at the number of years that it's been since 1996 or 7 when the 7th principle was enacted. We're looking at 23 or 24 years. So we're certainly outside of the 15-year cycle. And it's hard to imagine that post wars in Afghan and Iraq that we didn't, in that time of social upheaval and what was going on in the world, take a serious look at the principles. And here we are again, and now it's 2020. Mm-hmm. So I think we can go to the next quote. Or you go ahead, sorry.
Well, I'll go to the next quote, but I do also want to say that in 2000, there was some beginning works to look at our 7 principles that basically was tabled until 2006, and then it was actually looked at again in 2009. Erik, do you want to take this quote?
Sure, I can read it. In 2020, when everyone presumably will have perfect vision, great joke there, our current principles and purposes may also be perceived to have inadequacies that demand radical rewriting. And therein lies our genius. It is a process that is rightly called renewal or regeneration. And that is what has not changed and, let us hope, will remain unchanged 20 or even 100 years from now. Warren R. Ross, and that was from UU World in May 2006. So as we think about them static or living here, the principles as being a static document or a living document. I don't know, the challenge is always seeing a recalcitrance to move towards change, given the changing nature of the world and the challenges that we face as a society and as a faith tradition. So what is our next slide, Matthew?
So now we can actually kind of start our conversation. So in light of the social justice issues facing today's Unitarian Universalism, how can we think about the 7 principles given their nature as a living document? How could we interpret them now, and what could they look like in the future? And so we want to open it up to you all right now to get some feedback about what you think about our 7 principles. And if you can, answer these 3 questions.
Joe has his hand raised.
I just wanted to sort of put into the space that there's sort of talk about the principles being creedal. I see them more as aspirational. We affirm and promote them. I don't think that means necessarily that we strictly adhere to them in the way that creeds are generally sort of thought of. So I just wanted to just introduce some of that looseness, at least, to this effort. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other comments before we start addressing that one? Oh, Sanjay?
Well, there's been a lot of talk about embodying the 7 principles. So it sounds to me like we're getting less out of the head and into the body. And I think reinterpreting them from the lens of embodiment might bring them forward into the future. And also there needs to be education on where they came from, because some of this is taken, especially the interdependent web of life is from, there's a lot of these principles, inherent worth and dignity, that those came from somewhere else. They weren't birthed. They have a deeper history to that, and that's part of the embodiment. So looking at the more global nature of UUism and how it can be part of, it literally is a torch of global unification in a way, might be a way to bring that forward. I'm hearing a lot about getting back into the body, and I think that's wonderful, because being out of the body was something that was made up back in, I think it's in the Conrad Wright's book, which I really don't like. That said, he quotes here, he tells us in the history of this Protestant valued place was that emotion had no place, was not considered religious or devotional. Emotion with, what the heck's that all about? That's so cutting off. And I think we're discovering that disconnect is coming through, and I think we could really bring forward into that into the future, this using the body, dance, other ways of, and living social justice work being out there.
If I can, I just want to lift up that when we were at the camp, there was a participant who said that they saw our 7 principles as kind of like a guidebook to life. And Erik, tell me if I'm getting this right. The first 3 were the microcosm, right? And the remaining, was it 4 or the last 4 were the macrocosm? So the first 3 were more individualistic about the person. The last 4 were about the larger community.
Or was it the last 3 and then the
Yeah, I think it's the last 3. Because the free and responsible search for truth and meaning would be.
But yes, essentially that is it.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other thoughts? Because I think we do for sure want to come back and talk about the idea that our faith is, or that our 7 principles are becoming a creed.
So Kirk had his hand up.
Yeah, I'm sorry if I mispronounced. Sangye, is that how you say your name? Sangye?
Sanjay.
Sanjay, sorry, I was distracted earlier. What Sanjay was saying earlier resonated with me when we were going through the 7 in the presentation. I felt the impulse within myself to wordsmith, to sort of fix this word here, change that word there, and it speaks to, along with Sanjay was saying, just this feeling of these being created by a committee process, by worship of the words rather than the experience. And it can feel as though the theological understanding or the spiritual understanding beneath the principles is often lost because it's in the bylaws language. So I feel like I wonder what it means about the impulse to, is respect strong enough, right? Like I went into that sort of mindset rather than reimagining what the possibilities are. I just wanted to share that observation.
Thank you. Joe, did you have your hand?
Yeah, I kind of wanted to address sort of the first question, or at least some of the thoughts I've been having around it.
Oh, please do.
Yeah, so for me, one thing that's coming up, and I don't have like a solution for this, but our 5th principle enshrines the democratic process. And I think, it's very clear in our denomination that generally the majority is of one kind of particular race. And so when we have it enshrined in our document that majority rules essentially all the time, and that is how we organize. I don't know if that necessarily gets at the heart of what we really believe anymore. Because in a lot of ways it enshrines dominance culture in a very specific way. And I know that what they're going for, and I don't have like some other like political organizational structure to offer that would be more equitable, but I just wonder, when we are so locked in on that, it just really creates 51% rules. And when we have the homogeneity we have in our movement, that can cause a lot of issues on the social justice front.
And Sanjay, you had a comment?
Oh yeah, I'm in agreement with Joe. We should be more collaborative rather than dominant because of the colonialism involved in that, or in origin.
And I would say one of the things for myself is that I wonder and I question if the process that we see now and have been witnessing for those who are currently at General Assembly, if it's the same as what may have been happening then, if that makes sense, where again, that feeling or idea of wordsmithing happening, where people are fighting it out to get the perfect set. And if they just settled on this just to make folks happy, instead of thinking about what it means and will these live or will these take us into the future?
Well, I think that looking at it now, 34 years on, in hindsight, it feels weak maybe by what we need by today's standards, but I could imagine, and with more research, that in 1986, perhaps they were far more radical than they feel now.
And then we did just have someone join.
Anya.
Yes. Welcome, Anya.
Thank you.
So just to catch you up, we've talked a bit about the 7 principles, and
Okay.
where we are now is we are in our open discussion, and I don't know if you can see the screen, but we just have a couple questions up.
Yeah. I'm just going to listen in because I missed some. So.
Okay, no problem. I just wanted to give you an opportunity to speak.
Thank you.
My pleasure. So if you all could have a magic wand, and if you could change them, or if you could interpret them for today's standards, what do you think they could look like? Or what would they say to you? Joe?
Sorry, can I just raise one more thing on the first question?
Oh yeah, please.
Which is around, I've been feeling a lot of tension in the 4th principle around free and responsible, the free and responsible search for truth and meaning. Mainly who defines what's responsible, and what sources do we hold as those are responsible sources and other sources are irresponsible. And also there's like tension with that in the free part. And we don't need to go all into it because I know that it's a hot button topic, but you look at something like Todd Eckloff, and it's sort of this thing of, there's a sound, renouncing and, denouncing of him and his process. And, sort of this thing of, okay, well then if we have these free and responsible search for truth and meaning, when we put, go away from Todd Eckloff, when we put so much emphasis on reason, especially, is that what's responsible? Or if I say, oh, I had a divine inspiration and something came to me, I know direct experience is part of our sources, but is that considered responsible if that comes to define what I say is truth? And so to me, again, it just feels like it's academically focused, or there'll be deference to those kinds of structures, because those are legitimate. And like, oh, it's responsible because you read a scientific study that says X, Y, and Z, so you're allowed to believe that. Whereas, if you get that from somewhere else, it's irresponsible. So to me, it just feels like there's still, that dominant structure built into that as well.
I've always taken it to not so much in that direction, and I separate out kind of the free and the responsible. The free being we're encouraged to find our own path through the spiritual, and the responsible is in many ways like it's not about just showing up and giving the answer. The responsibility is to follow that as a path of learning that isn't just necessarily the easiest path or the lowest common denominator answer we can give. That's my own take on it. But I can see where you're coming from, especially with some of the, and Anya, could you?
Oh, my apologies.
Yeah, thank you. That's where I end up with it, but I can see, Joe, where you're going, given the hostile nature that can be observed among some congregation members when it comes to actual spiritual thought, as opposed to a rational scientific humanism.
And if I can, I'm just gonna proceed because I think our next question encompasses what I was starting us to ask. So, can Unitarian Universalism be the faith to bring liberation to all people? And this is an actual open question to you all. Do you think that as a faith, we have the answer, or we have one answer or a potential to be a faith that can liberate all people?
I guess I would ask, what is the definition of liberation within this sentence? Liberation means a lot of different things in different ways. So my English is struggling with that. So what would that mean?
So for me, in coming up with this question, it's about equity. And I say that because I think about the amount of Black, Indigenous, people of color who at one point or another, in my experience, felt like we were being moved to be separate. And now that we are in a place where we are working towards more solidarity, I'll just say this plainly, like for myself, I say this often, and this is kind of what guides me in my ministry, is we can't be free until we all free. And I mean, you can interpret that how you will, but for me, that means we can't be seen as full and whole people until we fully honor each person's ability to be who they are. Erik, did you have something different that you may want to add?
I agree, and I also think that this is certainly up for interpretation by everyone. It's like free and responsible search. It means something different to everyone. But if you look at the history of liberation theology since its start in the 50s, it has covered a number of different areas as separate theological fields of study. And each one of those is valid within this statement and within the faith of Unitarian Universalism, which includes the liberation of the poor in South America, and in America specifically, Black liberation and feminist liberation theology.
And Arian, did you have something? Because you look like you had a faith.
No.
Or made a faith.
No. I'm taking notes. Copious amounts of notes. You know me.
Joe?
So as much as I would like to say yes to this question, I think the answer is no. And I think the answer is no because I think that our faith is one of openness. And we're free thinkers. And I don't mean that like, oh, and everyone else sucks because we're free thinkers and we're open. I think some people aren't looking for that. I think that they don't feel liberated in open spaces. They actually feel liberated when they're given a lane and they can just do what they need to do. You know, if it's just as simple as say these 50 Hail Marys and you get to go to heaven. Like for some people, that's what works for them, you know, and putting, you know, a stack of books in front of them and saying, figure out your own theology. That's not who they are. And that's not what they want. And so, you know, I think that there's a tendency in Unitarian Universalism, because we're this container, sort of like more of a container than a creed sort of religion, that we believe that our tent is big enough to hold all people. And I do believe that our tent is big enough to hold all people, but that doesn't mean that people want to come into our tent necessarily. And I don't think it's just a question of, well, if we made the tent the right color, or we set it up this way, then they would show up. It's more just that it's just kind of a different strokes for different folks. You know, I think some people just like, you know, it's clear in our country, some people are more comfortable with authoritarianism than others, right? And as a faith, we are extremely uncomfortable with that. And I think we're all kind of like proud of that. But I think there's plenty of others who they're more comfortable with that authoritarianism because that's what they know. And maybe they grew up in a benevolent system of that or whatever it is, or that's where they're comfortable. So I don't know, I guess my last thing I'll say is just like, I think there's a desire in all faiths to be everything to everyone. And I don't think there's anything wrong with Unitarian Universalism understanding that we have a place in this larger web and that we're not the actual web itself.
Thank you for sharing that.
Sanjay.
Oh, thank you. Sanjay.
So from a Buddhist perspective, liberation means freeing from suffering, but that there are many paths, and it may not be this particular, Buddhism may not be your path to free liberation. So that's why I had a confusion. So it's really interesting to see. I think Unitarian Universalism is a great vehicle for a larger amount of people to use. It's one of the many choices, but there are many, like Joe says, many choices. But we can certainly say, hey, come and join us for a while. And I think that we can make a difference on that scale. And maybe even move past, you know, go get it and carry more. which is a noble and wonderful goal. And but I'm not sure it is. I think human nature and human beings, just the different pluralistic faiths that we all carry, it just right here shows that you need more. I would say it's more like a vessel for global collaboration. I'm sorry, English sometimes gets stuck and I can't get it out.
No, Sanjay, you were great. Can I actually call Kirk? Because Kirk, I see you moving over there, and it looks like you're ruminating, and you got some words you want to share as well.
Oh no, you've already figured out my body language. I resonate with everything that has been said. The language, and it's just my own way of saying it, is like Unitarian Universalism might be the ground from which the faith that can liberate all people, or faiths. And the other sort of phrase that's been going through my mind to honor Paula Cole-Jones is her emphasis on community of communities. And I feel like as my personal identity, my faith identity is shifting through seminary, this idea of Unitarian Universalism being the place where the tent metaphor, or the web metaphor, where people of different faiths can be in one place, supporting one another, and proud and empowered by their individual identities, while also joining the whole. So that's kind of what's moving me around.
Okay. And then before we move to the next slide, I just wanted to give a moment. Anya, was there anything that you wanted to contribute? You're muted.
Thanks. I was thinking along the lines of what Joe was saying. And what I would add to that is that it could bring liberation in the sense of openness or freedom to any person, but not every person. And there's a difference there. So yeah, so that's really what I wanted to add.
Thank you. Before our session, there was an email that came through from someone named Ruth Hoffman. I actually asked them if I could share this with you all. They say, I'm emailing because I am not tech savvy enough to know how to engage in conversation in the poster space. So, forgiveness, grace, all to you. But they said, I just wanted to share with you that in the small group discussion I attended yesterday, where we discussed Article 2, after much discussion, one of the members said that the problem with all of these principles was that there were few to no active verbs involved. Saying we agree with these statements is not the same as saying we are committed to actively working to make them happen. Promote is not even a strong enough word if you ask me. There is no accountability in that word. My creative process generally involves having a thought, question, etc., chewing on it for a while, bouncing it off a few people, chewing some more, etc., and then eventually coming up with a clear idea. I'm only at the first chewing on this, but wanted to share that much with you because I thought it was a terrific observation. Any thoughts?
Well, so Matthew, before we go to thoughts, we have 2 minutes left. And so I really appreciated the thing, but I think we should move on to the next slide and discuss it.
Yep.
Sorry, Joe, I saw your hand go up, but just we're out of time.
And I don't mind pushing the limits just a little bit. So I would say maybe give us an extra 5 minutes if you all can. If not, we completely understand. So our next slide is something, as Kirk happened to mention, there's another principle that has been floating around out in the youth sphere over the last, I'd say, 4 to 5 years, if not a little longer.
Since 2013.
Thank you. That was proposed by Paula Cole Jones, which is our 8th principle. Our 8th principle says, we, the member congregations of the Unitarian Universalist Association, covenant to affirm and promote journeying towards spiritual wholeness by working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and our institutions. And so I open it up for discussion. Unless, Erik, did you have something to add first?
Well, I think as a starting point for the discussion, I think the biggest piece of counter feedback that we got last summer was that this either A, doesn't fit in with the other 7 principles in form and style, or B, isn't this already covered by the other principles? And that was problematic in the discussion as we dug into it. But that's, I think, a good starting place to think about, like, how, like, that's the reaction. We can go wherever we want, but yeah, I'll stop now and open up the floor.
Arian?
Some of the responses that we've talked about around this 8th principle, or that you've displayed, is the same as saying, in a lot of ways, same as saying all lives matter in response to Black Lives Matter, because it's just an excuse not to take action. I think the 8th principle is necessary for us to move forward to acknowledge this sort of stuff. I do, 1000%. And I'm gonna be cognizant of time and be quiet now.
Thank you. Was there anyone else who wanted to comment? Joe?
I sort of wonder if you can actually just do away with the journeying toward. So it's just, we affirm and promote spiritual wholeness by working to build a diverse blah, 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 blah. It might sort of fit in better in that way as a principle. You know, for my only thing with this for me is, I guess I'm not, it's like, if this 8th principle is specifically about racism, then we center racism, okay? But to me, it feels like there's a lot of isms and there's a lot of different oppressions happening. And so to have the other ones be and other oppressions, it's like, I'm just not clear, why are we centering, like, why are we so focused on racism for this particular principle, when the and other oppressions, if this was adopted, would most likely, that would be where even more action would be, right? And even more sort of focus, because, you know, and I've talked about this with you guys in other places, but the sort of idea, like, of dominant culture, like, that's what we're learning about in schools. It's like about dominant culture and racism and sexism and income inequality and environmental problems. They all are falling under this umbrella. And to me, it feels like that's really what this 8th principle is getting at. And I don't feel like dominant culture is ever going away. And there will always be forms of it in our society. Not that racism is ever going to go away or sexism is ever going to go away, but to me, I see that as the larger thing. So I don't mean that in any way to take away from the causes of racism, but for me, I would wonder, why are we centering that cause when there are many, many types of oppressions out there?
So Joe, I have it's not an answer, but it is a thought. We center that for a couple of reasons. The first is that we are 97+% white. That's the thing, that's a key thing that sets Unitarian Universalism apart from just about any other faith. The second thing is that in the late 60s and early 70s, we as a faith walked away from Black people. And it changed the church potentially irreparably up until today. And it's still difficult to see how the repair is going to happen. And so racism is central to both just, I don't know, I'm just going to leave it there. I don't have to explicate more on that. But those are the two things I think that, go ahead.
The thing that I just want to uplift, and this is basically, I feel, Erik, please tell me if I'm wrong, sort of what Erik was saying, and as a person of color, Black specifically, when we look at the makeup of our congregations, like Erik was saying, they're about 90% white. And beyond that, when we're looking at Black folks and other people of color who are in our congregations and who are seeking the ministry, by a huge margin, we are left behind and left out. I think that because Black folks have taken the lead in some ways on this topic, that may be why that's also centered. But I think it's also just the tipping point of the conversation. And realistically, I think what we're looking for is people who are interested and invested in this 8th principle, as well as the other 7 principles, so that way we can find a way to create what our faith tradition is going to look like in the future. If I can just go back one more time, just to piggyback on another idea, is that, you know, can Unitarian Universalism be a faith for everyone? I ultimately believe that it can be. And I say ultimately because, as Sanjay mentioned, there are so many of us that are UU plus, UU and something else, which means for some reason, people who are the refugees or who have left their traditional faith practices are finding a home in Unitarian Universalism. And I think that we have the opportunity to really build a faith that can encompass what those other aspects of our identity are. And I think that the 8th principle is just the beginning. It doesn't mean that it is the end all. And as Alondria Williams, our UUA co-moderator, said yesterday, you know, we can add 1 more, we can add 5 more, we can add 15 more. Ultimately, as a faith tradition, it is up to us to decide what our principles are going to look like. And I think that one of the reasons people fight against adding an additional principle is because they believe so wholeheartedly, and church buildings and things have been erected around those 7 principles that we don't want to let go. We don't want to have to make the change, but our faith tradition is changing. And so maybe our principles and purposes need to change as well. Joe, you have a response?
Yeah, I love that. I love what you said there. I think that's great. And it kind of ties back to this idea, the idea also of the principles being a living thing. And in that space, I'm all for this adoption. And that, you know, when it's an ossified kind of like, well, for the next 300 years, this is going to be it. To me, I'm kind of going like, well, maybe we should take it a little further then, if it's going to be this sort of like set in stone rule, right?
Right.
But the idea that when it's like a living, breathing document in that way, then I'm kind of like, this is totally appropriate. You know, I feel like it's more appropriate for that particular like arena. And I love that. And it also just reminds me of the US Constitution, which is supposed to be the same thing, but is not at all. So, right, like this idea that the US Constitution is supposed to be this kind of living document, but like it's only been amended a handful of times, right? But like the founding fathers thought, oh, every 20 years we'll have a new one, right? So that's just kind of an interesting like way that ends up playing out with, you know, those good intentions.
And then
Sanjay has something to.
Can I say something real quick?
I'll just add quickly.
Yes, please.
I'm sorry, Michael, what?
I was just going to say
Matthew, what?
Thank you. I was just going to say that we're on our like last 3 minutes. So Sanjay, you're going to be our last comment.
Oh, okay. I just wanted to quickly say that if you center racism and work on that, some of the other oppressions will resolve. It's all
So thank you so much for sharing that, Sanjay. And thank you all for being present today. I'm so sorry that we are running out of time. But again, in the chat, I have dropped down the link for the Reimagining the 7 Principles Facebook group for those of you that do use Facebook, so that way we can continue this conversation. Again, this is going to be a larger conversation that is going across our association, as we were reminded yesterday by Alondria Williams. But please take this seriously, because normally it takes about 2 years for an additional principle or principles to be at a point where we can actually adopt them. And the longer we push this off and the longer we take, the longer the process. So,
well, and to note, there are 14 congregations that have already adopted the eighth principle, and we shouldn't have, and they've done it over the last several years. And so we shouldn't have to wait for more than 50% of congregations or something, because that would take decades to adopt the eighth principle. And hopefully there'll be a acceleration of the adoption as time goes on.
So again, thank you all. If you do have any questions, you can always email me. My email is mathewp.taylor@gmail.com, and that's MATHEWP as in Paul, period, TAYLOR@gmail.com. And I will repeat that one more time. It's MATHEWP as in Paul, TAYLOR@gmail.com.
And if you want to email me, almost all of you except for Kirk know my email address. So I'll leave it at that.
So again, thank you all for participating and being present today. And I hope to talk to you all soon.
Thank you so much for this. This was beautiful.
My pleasure.
Nice.
Wonderful. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Best thing ever.
Thank you, Sanjay. Bye all.
Bye, everyone.
Sorry, did I dominate that thing? Sorry about that if I did.
I'm still recording.